It was a victory more decisive than Zaph had dared hope for. The next thread had been pulled, the unraveling accelerating. Ted's frustration grew palpable as days stretched into weeks. He tried everything to recapture Sue's attention. Flowers, dinners out, small gifts left around the house. Nothing penetrated the wall she had erected between them, a barrier constructed from Zaph's commands and her own newly discovered desire for exclusivity. "I don't know what's wrong with her," Ted confided one evening as they worked late at the shop, his voice low and troubled. "She won't let me near her, keeps pushing me away." Zaph made a show of consideration, as if the solution weren't obvious. "Have you tried romance? Women need to feel special, you know." Ted seized on the suggestion with pathetic eagerness. "You think that's it?" "I have been busy with work lately." He nodded to himself, already planning. "I'll get her flowers tomorrow. Take her out somewhere nice." Zaph offered an encouraging smile. "Worth a try, right?" The flowers wilted untouched on the dining room table. The dinner reservation was met with polite indifference. Ted's increasingly desperate attempts at intimacy were rebuffed with excuses that grew thinner by the day. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of rejection, Ted achieved a minor breakthrough, though not the one he'd hoped for. "She let me pleasure her last night," he told Zaph the next morning, a mixture of relief and frustration evident in his slumped posture. "Wouldn't let me touch her otherwise, but at least it's something, right?" "Progress," Zaph agreed, already anticipating the confrontation that would occur later. "You just need to be patient." When Ted left for work, Zaph sought out Sue immediately, his expression thunderous. "You let him touch you!" Panic flashed across Sue's face. "No! I mean, not really. He kept begging, wouldn't stop harassing me. I only let him. I didn't enjoy it, I swear." "But you gave in," Zaph pressed, his voice cold. "After I was clear about what would happen." "Please," Sue's voice broke, her composure crumbling. "Please don't leave. It won't happen again, I promise. I only did it so he would stop pestering me." Zaph studied her for a long moment, allowing her anxiety to build before offering absolution. "All right, one more chance, but never again, understand? Not even that much." "Never again," she echoed, relief washing over her features. "I promise." That evening, Ted came home with more flowers, his face hopeful, clearly expecting to build on the previous night's minor victory. Sue received the gesture with visible discomfort, barely acknowledging his presence before retreating to the kitchen. Ted's confusion gave way to frustration, then anger. He followed her, their voices rising in an argument that echoed through the house. Zaph remained in the living room, listening as the confrontation escalated. The sound of something breaking, a plate or glass, was followed by Sue's frightened cry. Zaph rose then, moving to the kitchen doorway to find Ted standing over Sue, his face contorted with rage unlike anything Zaph had seen from the normally mild-mannered technician. "What's going on?" Zaph asked, his voice deliberately calm, despite the surge of adrenaline coursing through him. Ted whirled as if just remembering they weren't alone. "Nothing," he spat. "Just a little disagreement between husband and wife. None of your business." Sue's eyes sought Zaph's, wide with fear and something else, a silent plea for rescue. "I think you need to cool off," Zaph suggested, careful to keep his tone non-confrontational. "Take a walk, maybe." "In my own house?" Ted's laugh held no humor. "I don't think so. You take a walk, Zaph. This doesn't concern you." But it did concern him, of course. It was the culmination of weeks of careful manipulation, the pressure he'd applied finally causing Ted's composure to crack. This was what Zaph had been waiting for, the moment when Ted's mask slipped, revealing the insecurity and rage beneath. "If you're threatening Sue, it concerns me," Zaph said, allowing a hint of steel to enter his voice. Ted's expression shifted from anger to disbelief, then to a dawning comprehension that transformed his features into something almost unrecognizable. "You," he said, the word barely audible. "It's been you all along." Sue moved to Zaph's side, her allegiance clear. "Ted, you're scaring me. Please just go cool off." Ted's gaze darted between them, the final pieces falling into place. "You're sleeping with him? Behind my back? After everything we've—" He choked on the words, his face flushing dark red. "Ted," Sue began, but he cut her off with a gesture so violent she flinched. "Get out," he snarled at Zaph. "Get out of my house right now." Zaph remained motionless, his calm a stark contrast to Ted's unraveling. "I don't think Sue wants me to leave." The implication hung in the air, heavy as lead. Ted's eyes widened as he processed what Zaph was suggesting, that Sue would choose this young interloper over her husband of many years. "Sue?" His voice cracked on his wife's name, anger giving way to a desperate plea. Sue moved closer to Zaph, her choice clear without words. Ted stared at them, something fundamental breaking behind his eyes. Without warning, he slammed his fist into the wall, punching a hole through the drywall. Sue screamed as Ted continued his assault on the hallway, smashing pictures and leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. "I'm calling the police," Zaph said, reaching for the phone. Ted stalked into the kitchen, yanking open a drawer and pulling out a knife. "Put the phone down," he commanded, his voice deadly quiet now. Zaph complied slowly, carefully assessing the situation. Ted was beyond rational thought, pushed past his breaking point into a realm of pure emotional reaction. This was more than Zaph had anticipated. He'd expected anger, yes, even some property damage. But the knife suggested a level of violence he hadn't factored into his calculations. "Ted, think about what you're doing," Zaph said, positioning himself between Sue and her husband. "This isn't worth ruining your life over." Ted laughed, a harsh sound stripped of anything resembling humor. "My life is already ruined. You've seen to that, haven't you? You come into my home, eat my food, take my wife." His hands shook, the knife blade catching the kitchen light. "Was Mary part of the plan too? Getting rid of her so you could focus on destroying my marriage?" The accusation was too close to the truth for comfort, but Zaph maintained his composure. "You're not thinking straight. Put the knife down before you do something you can't take back." For a moment it seemed Ted might comply. His shoulders sagged, the fight visibly draining from him. Then Sue made the mistake of moving toward the door, and Ted's rage reignited instantly. He lunged forward, not with the knife but with his free hand, grabbing Sue's arm and yanking her back with enough force to elicit a cry of pain. What happened next occurred with the surreal clarity of moments viewed through adrenaline's lens. Zaph moved without conscious thought, his body operating on instinct honed by past confrontations. He caught Ted's knife hand at the wrist, twisting sharply until the weapon clattered to the floor. Ted's other hand released Sue to swing wildly at Zaph, connecting with his jaw on a blow that sent pain radiating through his skull. They grappled briefly, crashing into the kitchen table, sending dishes and glassware shattering across the tile. Sue's screams seemed to come from a great distance, muffled by the blood rushing in Zaph's ears. He managed to pin Ted against the refrigerator, forearm pressed against the older man's throat with just enough pressure to restrict his breathing without cutting it off completely. "Stop," Zaph commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos. "It's over, Ted. Look at yourself." Something in his tone, or perhaps the precarious position Ted found himself in, finally broke through the rage. Ted's eyes cleared, horror dawning as he registered what had just transpired. The destruction, the knife, the very real possibility that he'd been about to cross a line from which there was no return. "Oh God," he whispered, body going slack beneath Zaph's restraint. "What am I doing?" Zaph released him cautiously, ready to react if Ted's surrender proved false. But the fight had truly left him. He slumped to the floor, head in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The wail of approaching sirens filled the sudden quiet. One of the neighbors must have heard the commotion and called the police. "Sue," Zaph said gently, turning to where she stood frozen by the door. "Is there somewhere you can go? Parents, maybe?" She nodded, eyes never leaving her husband's crumpled form. "My parents live about 30 miles from here. Get some things together. Quickly." She disappeared down the hall without argument, returning minutes later with a hastily packed bag. The police arrived just as she finished, their authoritative knocks followed by calls to open the door. What followed was a blur of questions, statements, and procedural formalities. Ted, now subdued and seemingly in shock, offered no resistance as he was handcuffed and led away. The officers asked if Sue had somewhere to stay, When she mentioned her parents, they offered to escort her there for her safety. "I'll help her pack a few more things," Zaph volunteered, receiving a nod from the senior officer. As they moved through the house, gathering Sue's essentials, the reality of what had just occurred began to settle around them like fine dust after an explosion. "He's never been like that before," Sue said, her voice small and bewildered as she folded clothes into a suitcase. "Never violent. Not in all our years together." Zaph made a non-committal sound, unwilling to point out that Ted's transformation hadn't been spontaneous but carefully engineered. The knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, heavy with the weight of consequences he hadn't fully anticipated. "What happens now?" Sue asked as they loaded her bags into the police cruiser. Zaph shrugged, affecting uncertainty, though his mind was already mapping out next steps. "I don't know. That depends on you, I guess." She reached for his hand, squeezing it with desperate strength. "Would you come with me? To my parents?" The request was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Another thread to pull, another piece of the unraveling tapestry that had once been the Morrow's marriage. "Of course," Zaph said, returning the pressure of her fingers. "I'll be right behind you." As he watched the police car pull away with Sue inside, Zaph allowed himself a moment of reflection. The plan had succeeded beyond his expectations, but the victory felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge that he'd pushed a man to the edge of violence, perhaps even to the brink of something much worse. For the first time since New Year's Eve, doubt crept into Zaph's certainty. How far was too far in this game of revenge? At what point did the destroyer become as corrupted as those he sought to punish? The questions lingered as he got into his car and followed the police cruiser's taillights into the gathering dusk. Red pinpricks that reminded him uncomfortably of eyes watching in the darkness. The devil's eyes, perhaps, watching his handiwork with approving interest.